Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And it is a very special day because I have Anne Whitaker with me. And it is extra special because we're going to be discussing a marvelous book, which happens to, on this occasion, rather surprisingly, not be Anne's, but it is Liz Greene's book. And the Horoscope in Manifestation, Psychology and Prediction. And here it is. It's rather beautiful. And it is this conversation.
And here's my old hardback copy from way back when.
Way. So
and I'm so happy. I'm so happy that Wessex Astrologer are republishing all these, aren't you?
I absolutely am. And the exciting thing is that this is the first of a series of conversations that I'm going to be having with various people about Liz Greene's beautiful books. So yours is the first.
Wow.
And,
thank you.
And it is, I consider Liz Greene to be one of my great teachers, even though I have never met her. And I am the astrologer I am, thanks to her. But you had the wonderful experience of being at her seminars.
I can remember I was a student at the CPA, and in actual fact, I was at both the seminars that this book is based on. And Liz actually took an example of mine in the second seminar to use as part of the discussion. But I had the good fortune to be, well, I suppose the persistence to be getting up at 5 in the morning and flying down on the 7:10 red eye to London from approximately 1991. And then I started studying with the CPA for my diploma in 95 and finished my diploma in 1998. So I had the pleasure of sitting in on a number of Liz Greene seminars, and I can never forget the very first one. Is it okay to say a wee bit about this?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, the very first Liz Greene seminar, and I'd listened to her work for years before that. And I remember the first Liz Greene tape I heard sometime in the 1980s. And I thought, and that was at the beginning of my studies, and I thought, I want to study with her. But it took me until the 1990s to actually get to the place where I could. And the first one of her seminars I ever was at was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and aspects. And I was absolutely rapt because my whole horoscope hangs around a Jupiter-Saturn square, a very prominent Jupiter-Saturn. And I was sitting there listening to her describing my family life, because it absolutely described what was basically going on in my family, starring my father with my mother as a very secondary role. And I thought, this is amazing stuff. So, and what Liz could take out of a chart, you've been to some of her seminars at the CPA. What she could take out of a chart was just amazing. Her clarity and perception was just amazing. And although she absolutely did not encourage any of us to guruify her, and my nature is such that with Mars conjunct Uranus, I wouldn't guruify anybody, but I have huge respect for her work. It very much chimes in with the way I thought myself right up until the time I started going to CPA seminars. I'm very Jungian in my approach to things. And I consider that Liz Greene has influenced my work and my being more than anybody else.
And that goes the same for me too. So I think that's, on that note, we should probably start looking at the book itself. And it's, what I love about this is that she really looks at how our makeup is rooted in the past before we're even born, which is, one of the big buzzwords of our time, of course, is ancestral healing, ancestral wounds. And, there's a focus on that. And this book goes right into the heart of it. And in fact, the seminar that I'm taking part in at the Lodge next month, it's interesting because it is the stuff of what I'm going to be doing, because we're looking at karma astrology, but I'm looking at how karma is rooted in the ancestral past. And
Mm-hmm.
here is the book talking exactly about that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the lovely things. And she, right at the start, and I've written a quote here. She says, "We can view complexes from an archetypal or mythic perspective and get a glimpse of the deeper meaning behind a person's experiences and development pattern. What we're really looking at is a psychological model of fate." And that, when I read that, it's like it jumped off the page and did a dance in front of my eyes, because
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what we're looking at, isn't it?
Yep. Yep, it is. Well, I made a few quick notes. I mean, I've had a reread of the book, and it's so complex. We're only going to be able to scratch the surface in this. But I've just written a few headlines. Tracks one, archetypal patterns, and how we explore them as humans. First of all, via myth. These were our earliest ways of talking about the archetypes. And then following on that, we have the complexes that occur in human life, both individually and collectively. And one of the points Liz made very clearly was that complexes are not necessarily negative, but they are compulsive. They're the kind of driving energies of the psyche. And then she takes it down to astrological symbols in the natal chart. So by the time you get to the astrology, you have a good sense of the progression from the archetypes. And then the last point that I've written down here is the ripening of complexes is indicated by transits and progressions. And she makes a very, very, very valid point, which is that what we're looking at is the archetypal core of a pattern or a complex, but it has many branches. Some of it is to do with fate, some of it's to do with family manifestation, some of it is to do with unconscious patterns and projections. And where we can exercise free will, what I've taken out of it, is by working with these patterns that we develop some kind of conscious awareness. And that helps us to express the energies in these complexes in a more constructive and choice-oriented way. But I mean, Liz always makes clear in all her work, well, she said in one seminar, we 20th century people are not as free as we like to think we are.
Yes, it's a very true statement. I think possibly now more than ever. But I think what I what I love about this is the way in which she tracks from those statements about what a complex is and the relationship with fate, and the fact that we think that we are acting freely, but we're acting on, our behavior can be quite compulsive until we become aware of it. And then we're
Yep.
breaking family curse in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's very clear. But what I also like is the way she then goes on to say that, yes, it's the point at which these complexes become clear and we can break free from them is to do with the transits and the progressions. And I think that makes me think of that whole principle of Chiron and the Chiron wound, how when we receive transits to that Chiron wound, suddenly we have no choice but to do the work if we're going to actually do any healing. And so, but it, of course, we talk about that in the context of Chiron, but it's true of all aspects of the chart. That's the complexity of the chart is such that every transit is touching on something that is propelling forward towards our personal development and hopefully the path of healing and breaking free from those family issues.
Yeah, and I think that's very well put, Anna. And I really think also, I mean, I've got a long background as you have it in working as a counselor as well as an astrologer. And my overall impression from my life is that most people would prefer not to scratch the surface or go beneath the surface if they could be left in peace to just get on with it. But unfortunately, our complexes do not leave us in peace. And I really, really do think that one can choose at an unconscious level not to work with the material we're given, in which case it gets completely projected. I mean, a very good collective example of this takes me right back, I think it's the 1980s, where President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And I remember listening to him saying that and thinking, this is a massive projection onto another land. And what you should be doing is taking back these projections for us as our leader and looking at the darkness within ourselves. And I think I came across a wonderful statement some time ago, which I boringly quote to everybody. I may even have quoted it to you, but it's really, really important. Edward O. Wilson was giving a lecture to Harvard in 2009, and he said the problem with humanity basically is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think that the savagery of the contemporary world and what we're going through as a human community just now tells us that we have not managed to deal with our own savagery.
Interesting.
And I think that at a tiny individual level, each of us has work to do to face up to our own shadow material and try and work with it. And in that way, we can maybe redeem something for the collective.
As you know, it's interesting that you should say that, because, or use that quote, because I explain to people that we have an amygdala, and that's our fight, flight, freeze response.
Yep.
And
yep.
The thing about that is that is instinctive, and it's linked with our survival. And so to be able to get beyond those feelings that are instinctive and reactive is very, very difficult. To keep a cool head when our emotions are intense, so intense, is very difficult. And people often think that our way out of this is by rationalizing everything, but it is actually, that's not right either, because that's the suppression of these intense feelings. It is part of our humanity. It is part of being a mammal, actually, part of being part in the animal kingdom, because that is what we are. That is where we are from, and that is what we are. And there isn't a, there are some huge differences between us and other animals, but they are not as big as we think. And it's that part of the brain with all of these intense emotions, we need to come to terms with it and understand it. And we might see as our shadow, I would say it's just dealing with the different aspects of our humanity, and can treat ourselves with kindness and accept that we have these impulses and name them already. That's light.
Well, I think, I think the important thing to recognize is that if we didn't have that, if you like, that savagery, we'd never have evolved to the stage we're at now. But the point is that it's hugely inappropriate in many contexts to bring that fight or flight, survival, savage, I will survive anyway, no matter what quality, to our interactions as supposedly civilized beings. And, we need to work with the light and the dark in ourselves. We absolutely do. As you say, the light of reason can only take us so far. We have to face our primitive side and try and be humble in the face of it and own it. And I think that's hard. I mean, some of the impulses we have towards other people, I think, really need to be contained. I'm sure I am not alone in sitting here confessing that there have been times when I have wanted to throttle people in the past. And maybe their behavior justified that impulse in me, but it's not appropriate to go and do that. You have to try and behave like a civilized being, or if you want to go back to your brain chemistry version of it, then it's we're talking about the same thing except from different perspectives. And Jung is very, very strong on, if there's something wrong with society, there's something wrong with me. If there's something wrong with me, I need to work with my own material and not project it onto other people. But then the only way we find out about what we're like is when we see our projections in action and we can begin to spot them. So Liz makes the point in this book that projection isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how we learn to begin to get to grips with our dark impulses and try and modify them.
I often, in dealing with clients, the issue of relationships, and the thorny bits of relationships
Oh,
come up,
yes. Oh, yes.
can imagine.
Yes.
And you know, one of the things that I always say I want to help them do is disentangle the baggage so that
Yeah.
all the clearly labeled as to which baggage belongs to whom, so that we can get away from the projections.
Anna, this makes me laugh because I'm very fiery, and my late husband Ian was very. I'm a fire water personality. My late husband Ian was earth and air, so you can imagine some of the clashes. And I would sometimes get furious and rant away at him, and he would patiently listen to me. And then I would sit there and grin and say, "But of course, I am completely perfect, unlike you." And then we would fall about laughing. So I was owning the ridiculousness of my behavior and also honoring his patience with me. But you don't arrive at these points of understanding without struggle and without fighting. And the important thing is to take ownership of your own behavior and what you are putting into a relationship. And
Nice,
very
neat,
often people don't.
nice, neat labels on the baggage, and then everybody knows where they are and who's responsible for what. And that's not easy. That's very difficult for us to do because it requires us, in some respects, to step outside of our feelings. And
Yeah.
one of the things you were talking about there is humor.
Mm-hmm.
And very often when I'm feeling intensely, what I do is I push the argument to the absolute extreme within myself, but
Mm-hmm.
I absolute extreme, at which point it becomes hysterically funny.
Oh yes. Oh yes. I know that one. Yeah. Yep.
And I think,
But
oh, okay.
Liz makes the very good point in this book, though, that humor is a dimension of the ego consciousness, because the unconscious has no sense of humor at all, and we need humor. God, can you imagine what life would be like if we couldn't laugh at ourselves first?
That's such a good point, that that the unconscious has no humor. Of course it
Mm,
doesn't. It's
yeah.
literal. The unconscious is literal. So when I'm working as a hypnotherapist and I am, let's say I've been through the part of the session that's regression, and we've made some nice breakthroughs, and we're now at the end, and what I want to do is reinforce everything through a story and visualization to help my client cement the new perspectives that they've
Yep.
made.
Yep.
I have to be extremely careful with my language because the subconscious is very literal. And so I have to make sure that everything is in a positive, that everything that might be perceived as an instruction is a positive instruction, and so on. It's not because my clients are incredibly gullible. No, it's because they are in that state where their subconscious is wide open, and I am now addressing the subconscious. And so everything is very literal, to the point where we have to be careful to say things like, I don't, you don't remember. You have to say things like, remember that, or
Mm-hmm.
instead of forget that, because otherwise it's going to grab that forget, and they're going to forget the very thing they need to remember. The instruction needs to be remember. So we have to think about this. So if it's because it is very literal, the subconscious can't possibly have that sense of humor.
No,
It,
absolutely.
to be able to laugh and to have that sense of humor requires other things that are going on. So,
Well, I think it also requires being able to laugh at yourself or your behavior is, I think, a recognition that you've processed stuff sufficiently, that you can stand back from it. You haven't stood back from it to distance yourself from it. You've stood back from it as a part of the process, and you can now look at it and go, "Gosh, that really was over the top. That was so inappropriate." And I've just when you were talking about you have to be so careful what you say to the client from the perspective of the work you do, I remembered a section from this book which I've highlighted. Can I read it to you? Because
oh yes,
it's called The Response of the Client to Prognosticative Advice. Shall I read you a wee bit?
oh, yes, please.
The audience says, I have found that when I give advice to clients about transits and progressions, they usually do exactly the opposite. I wonder why I bother. Do you think there is something in people that has to reject what the astrologer tells them? And Liz says, not as a general rule, no. When somebody goes to the trouble of coming along and spending money for a chart reading, generally he or she makes the effort to listen. But a lot depends on what you mean by advice and how you are offering it. Telling people what they should or shouldn't do under a particular transit or progression may provoke some deep need in the client to exercise free will, because the archetypal background of an astrological reading unconsciously invokes a sense of fate and a cosmos which could grind one's will down if it so pleased. If the astrologer then adds to the client's sense of impetus by saying, if you don't do what I say, such and such will happen, the client may understandably feel impelled to prove the astrologer wrong. And the last bit she says, I do not believe our job is to give advice of a kind which takes away the client's decision-making capacities. It is more relevant to help the client understand the options reflected by a particular transit or progression and the deeper issues underlying the situation. There you go.
Well, perfect.
So
The thought that I did nearly fall about laughing when you were reading that, and yes, when I first read it also, because that's just not our job, is it? Our job is not to tell people what to do. Our job is to hold the mirror and say,
yeah,
these are the possibilities.
yep,
What do you feel? And
yep.
what it's such a rich experience. I was doing some readings last week, and people just got back to me to say, oh, I love those suggestions. I've been thinking about things like that myself, and to hear
Mhm.
somebody say it, brilliant. That's what we want. We want to be helping people open up their imagination to the possibilities
Precisely, precisely.
and see what sits right with them.
Yep.
I can tell you, it's recently, because I've been doing a medical astrology course, and I brought a chart to the class, um, based on a rash that was stubbornly refusing to leave, if I can put it like that, despite
Okay.
despite my best efforts with all sorts of beautiful things that I was using. Um, and our teacher, for whom I have the deepest respect, gave some wonderful suggestions, some of which I had already taken on board. And this was based on the chart because it's a medical astrology chart. But then he
Mhm.
said, the obvious. He said, and you could try fasting. And I said, never tell a Taurus to fast.
That's good.
which, he thought was, which he thought was hilarious. But it's absolutely right, because I know fasting just not work for me. But 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 what that then did was it opened up the discussion of
Mhm.
what kind of fast might be suitable for me. And that
Mm-hmm.
I was already on there. I was already looking at what
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
eliminated
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
more suggestions. And that was
Yeah.
perfect
Mm-hmm.
example, because here we
Well,
are. And I know I'm not going to fast. There is, it's just not going to happen. I I'll faint. It's just
and also it's part of your structure. It's part of the way you are as a human being. It plugs right into your unconscious structures and compulsions and patterns. So if you poke that bit of a person too hard, they're going to react very negatively. And
and
one of the things you'll remember this from Liz Greene's seminars, she was really, really good at dealing with people. I mean, there are wonderful example charts throughout all her books. And one of the, you probably will respond to this, one of the things I used to be amazed at was how Liz could just take a chart she'd never seen before, and what she could take out of it was amazing. But the fact of the matter was that she was always respectful to the client's vulnerability. She was very straightforward and very frank. And Liz, sometimes she would say things that really needed to be said, but she said it in such a way that it didn't deliver wounds to the other person. And also she was very strong on the fact that, when you're dealing with unconscious compulsions, you have to handle the person and the bringing of that to consciousness so carefully. And also, one of the things I think you'll understand this being an astrology teacher is I used to really insist with my students, if we're looking at, say, the moon conjunct Uranus, I would push them into describing for me the essence of this pattern. And I would draw a circle around the moon Uranus and then put a whole load of branches and say, there are all these branches. Now give me some branches off the top of your head. And then you would make the point that when you're working with a client, you cannot know how this is going to manifest until you have engaged with them. And all you can do is give them some sort of general map and direction about the ways they might want to go, which was in accord with the structure of their psyche. And
and
that's the best we can do. I think I just do not, I don't think that for me it would be appropriate ever to do definite predictions,
it would.
because there's a range of possible things that can come out. You can alert somebody if somebody's got Uranus coming up to their descendant, then you know that the at least freedom and space and differentness and unusual experience is going to come your way, and you're going to want that from your relationships. So you can give that information to the person, and then it's up to them how they deal with it.
Absolutely. There's so much there. Firstly, I feel that if we're dealing with the psychological part of astrology,
Mm-hmm.
then we must understand the essence of the myths that we're dealing
Mm-hmm.
with,
Yeah.
because then that allows us to extrapolate to a various array of possibilities. And when I'm working with clients, I give them the array that comes to my mind, and I say, you
Yeah.
might think others too. There might be others, because
Yeah.
there are other possibilities. And then what happens is they use their experience to connect with
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yeah.
and they will say, it's something in the middle of those two.
Mm-hmm.
So they tell
Yeah.
me more, and on it
Mm-hmm.
goes. But then again, when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to the predictive side of it too, there's no point in scaring people. It's a case of setting the context. So it's the context of the charts that you've been discussing,
Yeah.
and then it's the transit that you're seeing, and you have to, if it's one of those that really it can be really painful, you have to
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, there's an opportunity here
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
precisely on this.
I
and
mean,
and
what we're talking about just points out hugely the responsibilities we take on as astrologers and the importance of us being in supervision or our work being mentored or whatever. I mean, Liz came out very strongly in the 1980s and said this, and she really she got quite a lot of pelters for it. But what she was saying was, look, she said to us, you have to be in therapy for a year to do this course. You have no business poking around in somebody else's psyche unless you've had the experience of that yourself. And I think that all of that is what we bring to the table as professionals. And we need to be respectful of people's right to make their mistakes if that's what they're going to be doing. Because I know that I've learned far more from my mistakes than any of the positive things I ever did.
We do not have a monopoly on knowledge and understanding. And the only expert on the person sitting in front of us is the person.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it's having that humility that enables us to honor the
Yeah.
individual person in front of us and
Yeah.
consequently honor the art that that's so much a part of our lives as well.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
very important. And so I think there's no bigger challenge for me personally than when I'm working with somebody, not from an astrological perspective, but from a therapeutic perspective. And I can see, oh, crumbs, there's Pluto coming up to oppose this moon.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I think, okay, I'm really going to have to be extra careful here. And I think perhaps this therapy is not going to end as soon as we might hope. Um,
No.
that's
No.
okay. That's
And
okay.
finding the balance between compassion and honesty is one of the decision regarding what to hold back on and what to share with your client is such a big decision to make, because we need to be truthful with our clients. We need to bring honesty and compassion and truth to the table, but we also need to know when we need to hold back on what we think we're seeing, because what we think we're seeing at times might be our projections onto what we're actually looking at. And that's something I think we have to be careful of. Because I used to take my mantra was, send your client out of the room with more of a sense of power and agency in their own life than they had when they came into it.
That has to be the case. I was just
Yeah.
thinking the number of times I've heard clients say, "Oh no, don't worry, you could be honest. Tell me." and I, and I always say to them, "I promise you, I will always be honest, and I will always tell you what I see. But I need to find the right words so that we understand each other, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm hesitating. It's not because I'm wanting to sugarcoat. It's because I'm looking at the best way to communicate
Yeah.
what I'm doing. And so then they relax because they're worried that there's something horrible that I'm seeing that I'm not going to tell them. No,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the
And
way it is.
there's also the thing that, we're not always right. We might look at something and think, okay, maybe that looks like what it might be, but it could perhaps be something completely different. It's, the more we talk about it, the more I think, oh my goodness, how were we ever brave enough to become astrologers, really? Because one of the things I used to say to my students years ago, I mean, Liz Greene would have liked this, I'm sure, was I used to say to them, okay, you've come to 4 classes, now tell me about your power drives. And you would see the jaws dropping and they would go, what do you mean by that? And I would say, well, if you are coming to learn this art, it means that you are attracted at some level to the power of it. And because of that, you need to look at yourself and see what it is in you that's compelling you in this direction. In other words, what's the complex behind you taking a step into studying astrology? And that used to separate out the sheep from the goats quite a bit, because you would sometimes get people just not turning back up after that class. And that was fine by me.
That's fun.
So I don't know what you think of that, Anna, but that was one of the things. I mean, Ian used to, I taught from the house for years, and Ian used to pass by the door of, he was so patient with me. He was very happy for me to teach classes from the house, but he used to say, sometimes I pass the door and it seems like church is going on in there. You could, apart from your voice, you could hear a pin drop. And other times I pass and there's gales of laughter. And I know your students are having a good laugh at your expense. So, you know, there are all these registers we move through. And one of the things I really admired about Liz Greene was how she moved through these registers with such care and such compassion, but also such honesty and directness, really. She's still fortunately with us. She's doing a whole pile of seminars for MISPA soon on Mars. So she's still very much with us, but by gosh, she was really good, and I'm sure she still is. Anyway, I mustn't ramble. Am I rambling, Anna? Am I rambling? Stop me from rambling.
No, I don't think you're rambling. I think you are expressing uh, principles which are extremely important to you, and I feel are very important. And yes, indeed, I think that you're right. Um, that our beautiful teacher, I'm going to call her Liz Greene,
Mm.
um, would share those principles, because otherwise this book could not have been written. I think that
No,
this is
no.
the beauty of it. Um, and coming back to it again, because we've been talking around it, but everything that we have said is born out of the lessons that are in here. Um,
Yes.
so I think that that's really very, very important. What this book is to me is, as with every Liz Greene book I have ever had the joy of reading, it is a psychological, an in-depth psychological look at different aspects of humanity
Mm-hmm.
and how astrology is the most beautiful and useful tool in coming to understand those complexes that beset us or support us or
Mm-hmm.
define us, the way you want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And how mythology is an inroad to understanding all of it. And I
Yeah.
think I can't help but make a comparison in, terms of this approach to psychology with what I'm seeing coming out of psychology departments at universities at the moment, which quite frankly is cold. And although there are some good things in terms of understanding neuroplasticity and the brain, it's cold because it's missing the spark very often. It's going, in many cases, towards looking at the brain
Mm-hmm.
rather than the human being, and understanding the brain and forgetting consciousness. It's becoming extremely mechanical. And I know that there are many psychologist departments where the name Jung is never even mentioned.
Oh, I mentioned Jung when I was working in psychiatry to the chief psychiatrist who ran our team. And do you know what he said? I tried to say something about Jung, and he said, "Oh, well, of course, we all know Jung was mad."
Yeah.
That was his response.
And there is a similar response regarding Freud. And whatever we might think about Freud or Jung, and which camp we might be on or whatever, it doesn't matter. The fact is that these early modern psychologists, and I'm going to call them modern because clearly our ancients were busy understanding psychology too. It's just that they didn't call it that. Um,
They used the myths to describe the
exactly.
human condition and the interaction with the archetypes.
I often say to people, astrology, amongst other things, is ancient psychology. That's what it
Mhm.
is. And
Yeah.
so, but when we lose that connection with those early modern psychologists, I think we're going to find we're going to be losing a sense of understanding humanity as a whole. And I think that's a very dangerous turn of events.
No, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that, I mean, one of the things that put me off psychology when I was at university is the reductionist tone of the whole thing. But you know, one of the things I love when I listen to these reductionists banging on about whatever it is, I think, listen, guys, we don't know what consciousness is yet. We don't know. And
Well,
I love the idea that most of that the band that we are aware of is so slender compared to the vastness of what we really don't know. We live in mystery, and consciousness does its best to pull something out of that in order to help us to live a reasonably sentient life here on planet Earth. But we need to be aware that there's so much that we don't know. And we should have some humility about that.
absolutely. Just thinking about what you said there about consciousness. Well, you know, one thing we know it isn't. It's not a programmable brain. That's,
No,
you know,
no, absolutely
I
not.
I can't program my dog, let alone another person. You know, mind of his own, and it's deeply respected, and he's very clear on what he thinks and feels about
Mhm.
different. And if I want to
Yeah,
change behavior, I have to understand how he feels, because
yeah,
then
quite.
I can work with his feelings and help him. And that
Yeah,
is no different to how we
yeah.
need to be with ourselves, which brings us back to this beautiful book. And I will remind everyone of the title. It is The Horoscope in Manifestation, Psychology and Prediction by Liz Greene. So I will be putting a link to it in the description box. And also, I will be putting a link to what you're doing, Anne, so people can find you. And
Okay.
and just tell us all where can they find you?
Well, you can find me on my website, which is Writing from the 12th House. So called because I have no less than 5 or 6 planets in the 12th house, depending on which way you look at it. And so that's www.anne-whitaker with 1T, WHITAKER.com. And the most recent thing I've put up is a Moon's Nodes compendium. You'll find that on the homepage, and it consists of all the writings I have done on the Moon's Nodes, all put together in one place. So I'm quite pleased that I managed to achieve that. So that's me.
Well,
Now,
I reckon
could I give that example that I that I
yes,
mentioned to you earlier?
do.
This is Liz Greene. Liz Greene is very she's very committed to the idea that by working with our own complexes and trying to bring more of our unconscious into consciousness, we can not only help ourselves along the road, but we can have some sort of contributory effect to the evolution of human beings. And we can also begin to heal family inheritance, all of that. Now, the example I have is an absolutely stunning one. There I was on the 11th of April, 2018, Clue, my late mother's birthday. My husband and I were planning on going away. We were heading for Switzerland because he wanted to climb the Jungfrau. He was a hill walker and a climber, as my grandfather had been. And I was I was crying that morning. And the reason I was crying is because my husband had been knocked down by a bike in the park 2 years previously, hit his head. And ever since then, every so often, he would have what was described as a migraine attack, but what I think was a mini stroke. So I was desperately worried about us going away abroad and something happening. And I was sitting there crying. And I suddenly thought, today's my mother's birthday. I'm going to look at the ephemeris. And in the ephemeris, Pluto at 21 or 20, I can't remember exactly the degree, Pluto was sitting exactly on Capricorn, which is exactly where my mother's moon was. And it was square her sun, which was in Aries. So we had a sun Aries Moon Capricorn square triggered by Pluto. Now, if you go back, that signifies my parents. My father was an adventurer. My mother restricted him, sun, moon. If you go back to the next generation, my grandfather was an adventurer. My grandmother restricted him. He was in South America, cattle ranching, and he came home to the island of Lewis, quite an achievement by ship before the First World War. And he said, Mary Ann, we have this wonderful opportunity. I've got a farm in South America. Please come with me. That was the sun in Aries. And my grandmother said, Callum, I will come with you as long as we take my coffin along with us. So that's why I don't speak Spanish. So sun, moon, square, Aries, Capricorn in the family history. Sun, moon, square describes the relationship between my parents. I'm looking at a sun, moon, square. And my husband is the sun. He wants to go and do this mountain. He doesn't care that he's been knocked down by a bike. And I'm doing the moon in Capricorn, frightened. And I could have stopped at us going if I'd wanted to. And when I realized that, I thought, I am looking at a family complex here. I am looking at an opportunity to not do what my grandmother did, what my mother did, what I would be about to do, because I had a strong inclination to do the same thing. And I can still remember being absolutely astounded by that bolt of insight. And I stopped crying and put up a chart and looked at it. And I thought, well, there's some difficult stuff in here, but basically Ian and I have a Jupiter on the ascendant in our joint chart. And there was nice things going on there. I thought, this is going to be okay. And we went, and it was great. But I really, really felt that in some tiny way, I had redeemed something of my family inheritance. And it was a really, really, really profound moment in my life, which is why I wrote about it. It was published in Dell Horoscope magazine on my column. And I'll never forget that moment. And it was Liz, it was, reading her work and having been in her seminars that made the whole thing much more powerful. Because I realized that in that moment, I wasn't thinking Liz Greene, I wasn't thinking anything else, but I was doing it. I was redeeming my family complex.
And that.
So what do you think?
Well, it's exactly the stuff of the talk that I am right in the throes of writing or preparing for the karmic seminar on the 20th of April at the Astrological Lodge of London.
That's my late father's birthday. That's my father's birthday.
And so it is exactly that, because if we can't, and Liz actually talks about this in the book too, and I thought that was really, because the timing of it, just as I'm doing this for this seminar and she's writing about it and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, that's exactly it. That's exactly why I feel this, because we can talk about karmic astrology, but very often when we do, we talk about it as if the individual exists in a vacuum. So we're thinking about the individual's past lives, etc., etc. But we don't exist in a vacuum. We are in the context of a family, and that family has a history. And so this is ancestral stuff. And so the question is, to what extent does the soul coming in choose that family in order to develop, etc.? And we know that this is a very well-known principle, but consequently, it means that when we are looking at karmic astrology, we need to also be looking at those family complexes, or as the ancients
because there I was doing all that stuff in my kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. And so and that's the whole point. And in the seminar, I'm going to be looking at specifically three things: Chiron, Pholus, and Nessus. So I'm just going to use those three centaurs because there's quite a lot to do with family and ancestral stuff to do with those three. and to look at them in the chart is a very interesting way of bringing that mythology to understand some of that dynamic that's there. Because we always think of Pluto and we always think of the Noon's nodes, quite rightly so. They're my first port of call when I'm thinking about. Look at the T squares, we look at the grand crosses, we look at all of that. Yep, absolutely. But let's look at those three because they are specifically related to ancestral stuff in their own stories, and that's what I'm going to be doing. But it's that very principle that you're talking about, and I think the timing of this, as always, it's synchronous.
Well, I mean, you feel free to use that example if you want. I've sent you a link to the actual article I wrote, which sets the whole thing out pretty succinctly. So feel free. I'd be honored if you did. And if you want to share that link as part of this session, then feel free, because it really does. It really lets you see that we're not just talking theory. We're talking about stuff, the stuff of life that we can actually bring into our own way of being, and it can make a difference to us. And being able to feel that you respect and honor your family history, but you can also look at the complexes and choose to express these energies in a more constructive way than maybe your ancestors did, I think is an important way of walking your own life path.
It's important because not only does it set you free, but it sets the next generation free too.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That's very important. So, well,
gosh, that was a quick hour.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne, for your time today. And my thanks to Liz Greene for this beautiful book and for all books. There will be more discussions about Liz Greene's books coming up in the very near future. Until then,
that's it. Really interesting. Bye.